I was 29 when I gave birth to my daughter. I'd been married for 5 years, and while our relationship had its ups and downs, I honestly believed we were solid. My husband Mark and I had tried for over a year before I got pregnant, and when I finally saw those 2 pink lines, I burst into tears on the bathroom floor. Happy tears. Hopeful tears. We'd been planning everything meticulously. Birthing classes, baby names, nursery colors, hospital bag checklists. Mark was surprisingly involved for a guy who never used to care about the future. He rubbed my back during morning sickness, read those dad-to-be books, even started knitting, terribly, to calm his nerves. I remember thinking, he's going to be a great dad. I believed that down to my bones. We agreed early on that we wanted to keep the birth private. No relatives in the delivery, no surprise visitors. We even told both sides of the family not to come to the hospital and called them ourselves. My mom respected them. Mark's mom, not so much. From the beginning, my mother-in-law, Sharon, has always been a little intense. She never outright said she didn't like me, but her compliments always came with an edge. When I announced the pregnancy, she cried, but not out of joy. She later told me just hoped I'd be mature enough to be a mother, which was rich from a woman who once faked a heart attack to stop her son from moving out at 19. Sharon and I were close, but we were civil. Mark always played referee, and I tried to let most of her weird remarks roll off my back for the sake of family peace. Still, I insisted on firm boundaries once the baby. I didn't want her staying with us, and above all, I didn't want her making parenting decisions for us. Mark said he understood. He promised he'd talk to her. She'd stay in her to believe him. The due date came and went. After 40 hours of labor, I was taken in for emergency C-section. Things got hazy after that. There were complications. I lost a lot of blood. I barely remember the first 24 hours after my daughter was born. The only thing I clearly remember was the sound of her crying, sharp and alive, and the warmth of Mark's hand holding mine. He kissed my forehead and told me her name, the name we had chosen, or so I thought. I wasn't allowed to hold her right away. I was too weak. They let me see her, though. She looked just like Mark. Same nose, same tiny chin. I was in awe. Even in the haze of painkillers, I couldn't stop staring at her. It was the happiest moment of my life, but I didn't know what had already happened. I didn't know that while I was unconscious on a hospital bed with tubes and monitors beeping around me, my mother-in-law had arrived. Uninvited. I didn't know that she walked into that maternity ward like she owned the place. I didn't know she brought a copy of Mark's birth certificate, and I definitely didn't know that when the nurse asked Mark to confirm the baby's full name for the birth certificate. She spoke before he could, and he let her. I didn't find out about the name right away. When the nurse came in with the official paperwork, she said it like it was the most normal thing in the world. Smiling, friendly, totally unaware of the storm she was about to trigger. She handed me a copy of the birth certificate draft for my signature and said, "Congratulations again, Mrs. Walker. Little Lillian Rose is absolutely perfect." I froze. Lillian Rose. That wasn't her name. Mark and I had spent months arguing over names. We had narrowed it down to 3. We'd said them out loud, practiced them with our last name, tested how they sounded whispered, shouted, even as initials, and we'd finally agreed on Nora Elise. Short, simple, classic. I'd even stitched it onto the little white blanket we brought to the hospital, the one I planned to wrap her in when we took her home. But the paper said, Lillian Rose, and my hands were shaking. At first, I thought it was just a clerical error. Maybe someone had confused our file with another. But when I looked at Mark, he avoided my eyes. He was sitting in the hospital chair, suddenly very busy pouring lukewarm coffee into a paper cup. And then I knew. He didn't say anything, didn't offer a reason, didn't explain. He just looked like a man hoping the silence would be enough to avoid the fallout. I remember asking him, calmly, too calmly, what the hell had happened. He said he panicked, said the nurse had asked him to confirm the name while I was still recovering, and Sharon had said Lillian Rose out loud. Just went along with it. I couldn't believe it. He just went along with it. He said Sharon told him it was a family name, that it was what his grandmother had always wanted if they'd had a second daughter, that it would honor his side of the family, as if our daughter's name was some kind of legacy assignment instead of a decision made between 2 people who created. I asked him why he didn't just correct her, why he didn't tell the nurse the name we had picked together. He said he was overwhelmed, that Sharon had been so emotional, and that the timing felt too sensitive to cause a scene. Sensitive? I was lying in a hospital bed, cut open and barely conscious, and he was worried about hurting his mother's feelings. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stared at the birth certificate, trying to decide if this was real or if I was still foggy from the drugs. I asked him if he'd even tried to stop her. His silence told me everything I needed to know. He didn't fight for me, for us, for the daughter we created. He let his mother choose her name, like this was her baby, not mine. And the worst part? Sharon had already started calling her Lily. It was always meant to be. I didn't sign the form. The nurse must have noticed the look on my face because she paused and gently asked if something. I just shook my head and told her I needed more time. She smiled politely and said she'd come back later, then quietly stepped out of the room. Mark still hadn't looked at me. The silence between us felt heavy. suffocating. I turned to the little bassinet beside my bed where my daughter slept, wrapped in the hospital-issued blanket. Not the one I brought from home. The one I'd spent hours stitching Nora Elise onto, letter by letter, thinking how sweet it would be to hold her in it the day we brought her home. I asked Mark where it was. He said Sharon didn't think it matched the theme she was setting up in the nursery. I actually laughed. I mean, what else could I do? She didn't like the blanket, so she put it away. She didn't like the name, so she replaced it. And Mark just let her. No arguments, no pushback, just silence and coffee and cowardice. And then he had the audacity to ask me to be reasonable. Said it was just a name, that we could always call her Nora at home, even if it said Lillian on paper. Like I was being dramatic for caring what my own daughter was officially named. I couldn't even look at him. That night, when the nurse brought the baby back in from the nursery, she said, "Here's little Lily," like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't correct her. I was too stunned, too numb. I just stared at my daughter, wondering how something so small and so pure could already be the center of so much manipulation. When Sharon visited the next morning, she walked in like she owned the room. She brought flowers, balloons, a stuffed bear with Lillian Rose embroidered across its chest. She picked her up, kissed her forehead, and said she looked just like her daddy. She never once looked at, and then she said something I will never forget. She said, "I'm so glad we went with Lillian. Nora was such a cold name. This one feels right, don't you?" We, she said we, like she and Mark had made the decision together, like I hadn't existed at all. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan, and I was just the woman who gave birth to their idea of a perfect baby. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. The hospital room was quiet, too quiet, the kind that makes your thoughts louder than they should be. Mark was asleep on the pull-out chair, mouth open, blanket half on the floor. My daughter, was in the bassinet beside me, tiny fingers twitching in her sleep. I stared at her wristband. It had her hospital ID on it, her weight, her time of birth, and her name, Lillian Rose Walker. I felt like someone had scratched it in with a knife. That name stared back at me like a taunt. I hadn't even been conscious when it was given to her. She came out of my body. I carried her for 9 months. I survived the pain, the blood, the terror when the monitor beeped and they wheeled me into surgery. But somehow, I didn't get to name her. I felt disconnected from her, like I was suddenly the babysitter for someone else's child. I pressed the call button and asked the nurse if I could speak to someone about the paperwork. She looked surprised, but said she'd find the right person. About an hour later, a hospital administrator came in, clipboard in hand, and asked if everything was okay. I told her there was a mistake on the birth certificate, that the name wasn't what we had agreed on. She frowned, said she'd check the system. When she came back, she had a printed form in her hands, already submitted and approved, already mailed in. Apparently, Mark had signed it while I was still sedated. Said it was urgent so they could start the paperwork for insurance and newborn screenings. It was done. My daughter was legally Lillian Rose. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I asked her what I could do to change it, and she said the only way now would be to file a name change petition through the courts. A formal process. Fees, time, judges, all of it. And both parents would have to sign unless one could prove the other was unfit or absent. Mark chose his mother's name. He signed it without me, and now I'd have to fight to fix it. When I turned to look at him, he was wide awake, staring at the wall like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. He didn't apologize. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he said, "It's just a name. Can we please not ruin this week over something so small?" And I realized something then. This wasn't about the name. It never was. It was about control. We left the hospital 2 days later. Mark drove. I sat in the back seat with the baby because I couldn't stand to be next to him. I stared at the top of his head through the rearview mirror the entire ride, wondering how someone could change so much in just a few days. Or maybe he was always like this, and I was just too in love to see it. The house felt unfamiliar when we pulled into the driveway. It wasn't until I stepped through the front door that I understood why. Sharon had been busy. The living room had been redecorated. The neutral grays and creams I'd picked out were gone. Baby pink throw pillows were now stacked on the couch. A giant "Welcome Home Lillian" sign hung crooked across the mantel in glittery gold script. It looked like a Pinterest board vomited all over my home. Mark acted like it was sweet. "Mom wanted to surprise you," he said. I didn't speak. He carried the baby to the nursery while I followed, slow and sore from the surgery, each step a reminder of what I'd just gone through. The door to the nursery had been left open. I stopped in the doorway. I wish I hadn't. The soft lavender walls Mark and I did together were now covered in floral decor. The minimalist furniture we picked had been replaced. Sharon had brought in antique white furniture, frilly, bulky, completely baby-safe. There was a new mobile of glass roses. A giant cursive wooden sign hung above it, hand-painted with the words, "Lillian's Garden." My chest tightened so hard I thought I'd pass out. There was no trace of me in this room. None of the blankets I'd chosen. None of the baby books I'd arranged. Not even the mural I had painted by hand one afternoon when Mark was at work. Gone, covered with wallpaper. I asked him flat out, when did she do this? He told me it was last week. Last week. She'd flown in early, stayed in our home while I was still pregnant, painted over the mural, assembled furniture, replaced everything, and not once did he think to tell me. He said she was just trying to help. Then he had the nerve to ask why I was upset. Said, "Isn't it beautiful? It's every little girl's dream nursery." But I wasn't upset about the decor. I was devastated because it wasn't hers to change. None of this was hers. She hadn't just taken over a room. She had rewritten the entire beginning of my daughter's life. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that sign, Lillian's Garden, hanging over the crib like a brand. My scar throbbed. My mind spun. My daughter lay beside me in a bassinet Mark had moved into our bedroom just for the first few nights. He acted like that was some kind of generous compromise. I kept waiting for the anger to pass, for the fog to clear. It didn't. Instead, I got up sometime after midnight and wandered into the nursery. I just stood there in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the baby monitor, except something was off. It wasn't ours. I walked to the corner and saw it, an entirely different brand from the one we had purchased together weeks ago. This one was fancier, bulkier, had a camera with a rotating head, which was currently angled straight at the crib. A small red light blinked at the top. It wasn't synced to my phone, or Mark's. I picked it up, turned it around, and found a tiny sticker on the back, property of Sharon Walker. I felt cold all over. She didn't just redecorate the nursery, she brought in her own monitor system, meaning somewhere, in some room of our house, Sharon had set up a receiver, meaning she could watch my baby sleep any time she wanted. I searched the house. It was in the guest room, set up neatly on the nightstand, still plugged in, active, live. I yanked the plug out of the wall and felt a rush of something close to nausea. This wasn't just crossing a line. This was surveillance. This was obsession. I wanted to scream, to wake Mark up and demand an explanation, but I didn't. I went back into the bedroom, crawled under the blanket, and just stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. When I finally confronted him that morning, he looked tired, defensive, said it was harmless, said his mother was just worried and wanted to make sure the baby was safe, that it made her feel better being able to check in. Check in? Like this was her baby? He tried to convince me to leave it, said we could all use it together, said it would give us a break. I said no, not happening, not in this house, not with my daughter. So I packed it up, every camera, every wire, every cable, drove it to the nearest post office, and mailed it back to her. No note, no explanation. That afternoon she called crying, not to me, to Mark, said I was being ungrateful, said I didn't understand how much she'd done for us, how much she loved that little girl. He didn't defend me. He said we were all tired, that maybe we'd overreacted, that it was all a misunderstanding. And then I heard him say something I can never unhear. He told her, "I'll talk to her," not "we'll talk about it," not "we're figuring it out." He would talk to me, like I was the problem. 2 days later, I noticed something else was gone. It was subtle at first, just a weird itch in the back of my mind that something was missing. I was reorganizing the keepsake box I'd put together, ultrasound photos, the hospital bands, the tiny knit hat they gave us. I'd planned to frame her birth bracelet, the one with her real birth date and hospital ID, but it wasn't there. I emptied the whole box. Twice. Nothing. I asked Mark if he'd moved it. He said no, but looked away when he answered. I checked the guest room. Sharon had left 2 days earlier after we'd argued about the baby monitor. Her things were gone, but I opened the closet just in case. There it was, in the bottom drawer. My daughter's hospital bracelet, wrapped neatly in tissue, tucked inside one of Sharon's lavender-scented pouches, like it was some kind of relic she'd earned the right to take. I stood there holding it, shaking. She had stolen it. Not borrowed, not packed by mistake. Stolen. I never confronted her. I couldn't. I was too afraid of what else I might find out. But that night, I changed the locks on the house, and I didn't tell Mark. The final straw came a week later. We had our daughter's first pediatrician appointment. Routine stuff. Mark said he had a work call and couldn't come, so I went alone. I was nervous but excited to finally feel like I was doing something on my own, without interference, without Sharon. The nurse asked for the baby's name to confirm the file. I said, "Nora Elise Walker." She hesitated. Then she looked at the tablet in her hand and said, "I'm sorry. We have her listed as Lillian Rose." My heart sank. I told her there must be a mistake. We had discussed changing it, I said. She said nothing had been updated in the system, and that all appointments, test results, and vaccine records would be under Lillian, unless I filed a legal amendment. I felt my throat tighten. I never filed the court papers. I had looked into it, but I hadn't made the move. Part of me was still hoping Mark would see reason, that maybe once things settled, he'd understand what it meant to me, to us. Clearly, I was wrong. On the way home, I couldn't stop thinking about all the ways Sharon had crept into our daughter's life, like mold you don't notice until it's everywhere. She had her name, she had her nursery, she had her keepsakes. She had even picked the pediatrician. That's how she knew where we were going. I sat in the parked car for 20 minutes after getting home, just staring at the front door, wondering who exactly I'd married, because I realized something. This wasn't just Sharon. Mark let it happen, every step of the way. That evening, while Mark was in the shower, his laptop dinged. He'd left it open on the kitchen counter, and normally I wouldn't snoop, but the subject line caught my eye. Naming rights and guardianship paperwork. It was from Sharon. My stomach dropped. I clicked. The email thread was long. Too long. I scrolled past the polite hellos, past the let me know when she's in a better mood lines, and then I saw it, clear as day. Sharon had sent Mark legal templates for temporary guardianship. She said it was just in case. That with my emotional state and recent instability, it made sense to be proactive. She even offered to keep Lillian for a few weeks if needed, said it might give me time to get myself together. Mark hadn't shut it down. He hadn't told her she was out of line. Instead, he had replied, "Let's talk about this after the appointment. You may be right." That was the appointment I took Nora to, alone. I felt like the floor disappeared under me. They weren't just undermining me anymore. They were planning around me, like I was some ticking time bomb they were calmly trying to ease out of the picture. They didn't see me as a mother. They saw me as a problem, an inconvenience, an obstacle to their fantasy of a perfect little family. I closed the laptop. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I just looked at my daughter, sleeping peacefully in the bassinet beside the couch, and I knew then, without a doubt, I had to get out. The next morning, I waited until Mark left for work. I had already packed most of what I needed: clothes, diapers, my stitched Nora Elise blanket, and every document that proved I was her mother. I didn't tell him I was leaving. I didn't trust myself not to cry. Or worse, stay. My best friend met me at a nearby coffee shop and drove me and Nora 3 hours away to my parents' house. They were shocked, but not surprised. They'd always kept a polite distance from Mark. Said something about him always gave them a strange feeling. I wish I'd listened sooner. I spent the first night barely sleeping, not because of the baby, but because of the weight that lifted, and the fear that replaced it. I checked my phone the next morning. 23 missed calls, 11 voicemails, a dozen texts from Mark. The first few were angry, then confused, then panicked. He hadn't come home to an empty house. He came home to a note taped to the front door. "Nora and I are safe. Please don't come looking for us." I didn't mean it forever, but I needed space. I needed time. And after that email, I couldn't take a chance. I called a lawyer the next day. When Mark finally got a hold of me, he begged, he cried. He swore he never meant to go that far, that his mother was just trying to help, and that it had all gotten out of control. He said he'd fix it, but it was too late. I had already filed the paperwork to legally change her name to Nora Elise Walker, the name I whispered to her in the hospital when no one else was around, the name I sang to her under my breath when I rocked her to sleep. I sent him a copy of the form, not out of cruelty, but closure. Weeks later, when he finally came to see her, I met him outside. I didn't let him in. He brought flowers. I didn't take them. He asked if she'd remember him. I didn't answer. But I told him one thing before I closed the door. I brought her into this world. You don't get to erase me from it. And when I walked back into the house, I passed her nursery, the one my mom and I decorated with soft yellow and green. No signs, no decals, just warmth. Above the crib hung a wooden plaque I'd hand-painted myself, in the same script I'd used on the first blanket. It said, "Nora Elise's room," and this time, no one could take it from me.